What actually triggers the erasure of Egypt's history records? What does it take to make a king disappear? Not a battle, a chisel, a ladder, and a work order. High on a temple wall at Deir el-Bahri, a man stood on scaffolding and cut the face of a pharaoh out of the stone she had paid for. He was not hiding her from you. He was hiding her from the gods. You have walked past this kind of damage in a museum and called it age. Tonight I want to show you what the damage actually is and who signed off on it. That work took time. It took a foreman, a gang of men, a supply of copper tools that blunted against the sandstone. Somebody paid for it. Somebody wrote it down as a job. This is the first thing I want you to hold on to tonight, because it changes the whole shape of the story. The removal of a pharaoh from Egypt's records was not done in the dark by strangers who hated Egypt. It was done in daylight by Egyptians, on Egyptian orders, with Egyptian money in front of anyone who cared to look up. I have sat with that for a long time. And here is the part that took me years to understand properly. The man on the scaffolding was not trying to make you forget. He had no idea you would exist. He was doing something he believed was far more serious than that. In the world he lived in, a name carved in stone was a living thing that kept a dead ruler standing upright in front of the gods. Cut the name out, and you are not correcting history. You are reaching into eternity and pulling somebody out of it. That is a different crime, with a different motive, and I believe it explains almost everything that follows. So here is what we are going to do together. I am going to walk you through 4 episodes of erasure inside Egypt itself, each one with a king's name attached. Hatshepsut, whose face came off the walls under Thutmose III. Akhenaten, who cut out other people's gods and was then dropped from the king lists himself. Ramesses II, who recut older monuments and signed them with his own name. Psamtik II, whose campaign south is tied to a pit of smashed Kushite faces in Sudan. And I want to say this plainly before we start, because you deserve to know what kind of show you are watching. I am not going to sell you a conspiracy tonight, and I am not going to need one. The documented version is heavier. Then, near the end, we will settle the argument you have already heard 100 times, the one about the broken noses and the Sphinx. We will settle it the only honest way, with dates. Before we can talk about erasing a king, you have to understand what a king's name was. Look at any Egyptian monument, and you will find an oval, drawn like a loop of rope, pulled tight and knotted at one end, with signs sitting inside it. That oval is called a cartouche. The rope is not decoration. It is a circle of protection drawn around the name of a ruler, a line saying, "Everything inside this belongs to the one the sun goes around." Egyptians did not scatter that shape casually. When you see it, you are looking at a claim, and they carved it everywhere. Not once on a monument, dozens of times, hundreds of times, on doorways, on column drums, on the backs of thrones, on the soles of statue feet where no visitor would ever look. There was a good question buried in that, which is why a builder would pay men to cut a name where nobody could see it. The answer is that the audience was never only human. The name was addressed upward. Repetition was insurance. If one wall came down in an earthquake, 40 other surfaces still carried the king standing before the gods. And I think that instinct is worth sitting with. Picture the work. A quarry gang at Aswan, upriver, cutting a block of red granite out of living rock with hammerstones of dolerite, pounding until their forearms shake. Then the barge, then the mason, squatting in the shade of the half-finished wall, with a copper chisel and a wooden mallet, walking the signs into the stone, one shallow bite at a time. Granite is not forgiving. A slip ruins a week. He is not decorating a building. He is welding a man's identity into the hardest thing his country has, so that it will outlast weather, war, and every family quarrel that comes after. Now here is the belief that makes all of it burn. In Egyptian funerary writing, the dead are not finished. They are sustained, fed, kept standing, and one of the things that sustains them is somebody speaking their name aloud. The name is not a label on a life that ended. It is a thread still being pulled. To say it is to hand the dead a cup of water. That is not my poetry. That is the logic those texts run on. And once you see it, tomb architecture stops looking like decoration and starts looking like plumbing. That is why chapels were built where they were built. An offering chapel sat at the front of a tomb, above ground, open, with the owner's name and titles cut into the doorway at eye level, exactly where a passing farmer, priest, or relative would read it.
Many of those inscriptions do something that still move me. They talk to readers directly. They ask whoever is passing to speak the name and say a few words for the dead. And they promise the readers are blessing a return. A stranger's mouth was part of the machinery.
So follow that thread to its end. If saying the name feeds the dead, then removing the name starves them. Cutting a cartouche out of a wall is not graffiti, and it is not a tantrum. In the frame, the Egyptians actually lived inside. It is an execution carried out on somebody who is already dead. It cancels the offerings. It closes the mouth of every future stranger. Many of us today read that as symbolic, and maybe it was. But the men who ordered it did not appear to think so, and their opinion is the one that moved the chisels. Scholars have a phrase for this. They borrow it from Rome and call it damnatio memoriae. In plain English, that means the condemnation of memory, an official decision to strike a person's name and image out of public places. I want to be careful here, because the term is Latin and it comes from Roman practice. It is a label modern historians reach for when describing Egypt, not a phrase an Egyptian foreman would have recognized. One careful reading is that the two cultures were doing related things for different reasons, and here is the detail that surprises people most. This was paperwork. Somebody senior decided. Somebody drew up a list of surfaces. Somebody sent gangs across hundreds of miles of river valley and paid them and fed them and inspected the work when it was done. In some places, the erasure is thorough, and in others, the crew clearly ran out of enthusiasm halfway up a wall, which is exactly what you would expect from labor, not from rage. Vandalism is chaotic. This is orderly. That order is the fingerprint we will follow all night. So when I tell you that Egyptian history was cut, chipped, walled up, and re-signed, hold two things at once. Real damage, done deliberately, and a motive that has nothing to do with a modern argument about skin. The first erasures in the story were done by Egyptians to other Egyptians, inside a religion, inside a succession fight. Understand that, and you will be able to spot the second kind of erasure later, the one that used no chisel at all, and you will not be able to be talked out of either. Now let me take you to the clearest case in the whole story. Around the 15th century before Christ, in the dynasty Egyptologists number as the 18th, Egypt was ruled by a woman who took the full titles of a king. Her name was Hatshepsut. She began as the widow of one pharaoh, and the regent for a boy, her stepson. And somewhere in those early years, the arrangement stopped being temporary. She did not rule as a queen standing beside a throne. She had herself crowned, titled, and written into the record as pharaoh, which in that language and that theology was a male office. Go and stand where she built. On the west bank across from Luxor, the desert cliffs rise in one enormous curtain of limestone, and set against them, stepping up in three broad terraces joined by ramps, is her temple at Deir el-Bahri. It does not fight the cliff, it answers it. Colonnades run in long, straight shadows across the front. The stone goes gold in the late sun, and the whole building looks less like something dropped in the desert than something the mountain agreed to. I have never seen a photograph do it justice, and she covered it in her own account of herself. Her expedition south to the land the Egyptians called Punt, carved in scene after scene. The ships, the trees carried home in baskets. Her divine birth, argued out on the walls. Her titles, her cartouches, her figure in the kilt and the false beard of a king. Because that beard was not a disguise. It was the uniform of the office she was claiming. She was not pretending to be a man. She was wearing the crown the way the crown was drawn. Then, at some point after her death, men came with tools and began taking her out of it. Look closely at what they did, and the care of it is unsettling. This is not a wall smashed by looters. Her figure is cut away, and the scene around it is left standing. The offering table stays. The god stays. The registers of text on either side stay. Only she goes. And where her name sat inside its rope of protection, there is a shallow scooped hollow, sometimes with another king's name cut in over the top of it. Somebody stood there with a plan and a list. At Karnak, the same problem got a different solution, and it tells you a great deal about how these decisions were actually made. She had raised standing obelisks of red granite there. Single pieces of stone. Enormous, the kind of thing that takes a national effort to quarry and float downriver. You do not knock those down casually. So they were not knocked down. Masonry was built up around them, walling them in, hiding the lower shafts from view inside a new structure. The obelisk was not destroyed. It was taken out of circulation. And now, the beautiful accident. Blocks carrying her name and her images were pulled out of buildings, broken up, and used as fill, dumped into foundations and packed into later structures where nobody would ever read them again, which is exactly why we can read them now. Buried stone does not weather. Archaeologists have pulled her erased blocks out of the ground and out of later walls in their thousands, and pieced her chapels back together from the rubble that was supposed to end her. The very act meant to close the record is the reason the record survived in such good condition. I have never gotten over that. Her statues went the same way and came back the same way. In the 1920s, the Metropolitan Museum of Art ran excavations at Deir el-Bahari and dug out pits near the temple where her broken sculpture had been dumped. Faces, shoulders, whole seated figures shattered and thrown away. Those fragments were lifted, sorted and joined back together, which is why you can stand in front of her likeness in a museum today. Somebody spent good money to break her. Somebody else spent good money to put her back. Both of those decisions are documented, and neither one required a secret. So who did it, and why? The story you have probably heard is a family drama. The stepson, Thutmose III, grows up in the shadow of the stepmother who took his throne, waits, buries her, and then in a fury, goes around the country hacking her face off every wall he can reach. It is a good story. It has a villain and a motive, and it fits neatly into an hour of television. For a long time it was the standard version. And I believed it too. Then the evidence got in the way. In the 20th century, scholars working through the erasures at Deir el-Bahari and elsewhere looked hard at when the damage happened, using the sequence of what was cut over, and which royal names appear in the recut surfaces. The conclusion that came out of that work is that the campaign against her did not begin at her death at all. It began late in Thutmose III's sole reign, decades afterward, when he was an old and long-established king with the greatest military record in Egyptian history behind him. Sit with the arithmetic of that for a second, because it dismantles the whole revenge story. A man does not wait 20 years to lose his temper. Whatever moved that decision arrived late, and the most persuasive reading I have found is that it was about succession, about the shape of the line that would carry the crown after him, and whether a female pharaoh, sitting in the middle of that line, made his own son's claim harder to argue, not hatred. Housekeeping. And scholars still argue the detail, the exact year, the exact reason. So I am giving you the strongest current reading and not a verdict. That distinction matters more than it sounds. If the erasure was rage, it is a story about one bitter man. If it was legitimacy, it is a pattern, a lever any ruler can pull, and it will show up again in this episode, with different names on it. Hold that thought, because the next king we meet did not just get erased. He was, for a while, the most industrious eraser Egypt ever produced. A few generations after Hatshepsut, a young king came to the throne with a normal name and a normal inheritance, Amenhotep IV. The name itself is a sentence about loyalty, because it means the god Amun is satisfied, and Amun was the great god of Thebes, the god whose priesthood held estates, granaries, and enormous influence over the crown. Everything about that name said the new king would keep the arrangement his fathers had kept. Within a few years of taking power, he changed it. He struck Amun out of his own name and became Akhenaten, which points instead at the Aten, the disk of the sun itself. Then he did something no Egyptian king had done. He left. He took the court out of Thebes altogether, went downriver to a stretch of empty desert on the east bank where no city stood and no god already owned the ground, and started building from nothing. He called it Akhetaten, the horizon of the Aten. Today we call the place Amarna. Imagine what that took. Palaces, temples, workshops, storerooms, bakeries, streets for the workmen who built it. All of it laid out on bare sand in a matter of years. Because the king had decided the old capital was finished. Walk the edge of that plain, and you can still find how he marked it. Cut into the cliffs that ring the site are great carved panels, boundary markers, each one declaring where the new city begins and ends, and swearing that it will stay there. The king is shown with his family under the disk, and the sun's rays come down as long, thin arms, with human hands at the end of them, holding out life to the royal household. It is one of the strangest images in ancient art. It is also, I believe, one of the most sincere. And the temples he built for the Aten were open to the sky. No dark sanctuary at the back, no hidden statue in a shrine that only priests could approach. Courtyards, offering tables in rows, sunlight falling on everything. Whatever else you make of this man, understand what he was proposing. He was moving the meeting place between people and the divine out of a locked room and into the open air. That is a revolution in a country where the shape of a temple have not fundamentally changed for 1,000 years. But a revolution has a bill attached to it, and someone always pays. Because if the sun disk is the one that matters, then the rest of the crowded Egyptian sky becomes a problem. And here is where the man who is remembered as a victim of erasure becomes, in the plain record, the most thorough eraser in this entire episode. He sent men out with tools to remove the name of Amun from the country, not from one temple, from the country. Work gangs went up and down the valley, cutting that name out of temple walls, off obelisks, off the statues of earlier kings. And, remarkably, out of private tombs belonging to people who had nothing to do with the argument, ordinary officials whose fathers had been named after the god. In some places they went further and attacked a word for gods in the plural, the simple everyday word, wherever it appeared. Somebody in an office decided that a grammatical plural was a threat. Stop and hold that against everything you have been told about who erases Egyptian history. This is an Egyptian pharaoh in Egypt, ordering Egyptian workmen to cut Egyptian gods out of Egyptian monuments, and paying for it out of the Egyptian treasury. There is no foreign army in this scene. There is no European in this scene. This is theology and power moving through a bureaucracy, which is the least dramatic and most effective way anything large has ever been done. He died after roughly 17 years on the throne, and the whole thing came apart quickly. The court went back to Thebes. The old gods came back to their temples. And then the correction started, and it was carried out with the same administrative patience he had used, only pointed the other way. His city was abandoned. His temples were taken apart. His name was cut out of his own monuments by the men who came after him. Now here is the detail I find almost too neat to be true. Akhenaten had built fast, and to build fast he used small blocks a single man could carry, a technique that let unskilled labor throw walls up at speed. Egyptologists call them talatat. When the next kings dismantled his buildings at Thebes, they did not grind those blocks to powder. They used them. Thousands upon thousands of them were packed inside the great gateways at Karnak, as rubble fill, faces turned inward, hidden in the dark, which means the men erasing Akhenaten built him a vault. When modern archaeologists opened those pylons, the blocks came out with the paint still fresh on them, protected from sun and sand for 3,000 years, and scholars have been reassembling his lost temple scenes from them ever since. The erasure preserved the evidence. Say that slowly. The erasure preserved the evidence. That happens again and again in this story, and I do not think it is coincidence. Stone is heavy, labor is expensive, and reuse is always cheaper than destruction. The paperwork side is just as cold. Later kings kept official lists of their predecessors, carved in temple walls, a chain of legitimate rulers running back into the deep past. The famous list at Abydos is one of them. Go along that wall and you will find that the chain simply jumps. Akhenaten is not there. Neither are the short-reigned kings who came right after him, including the boy whose intact tomb would make him the most famous pharaoh on earth. They were not smashed. They were not cursed. They were left off the list, which is a quieter tool and a more permanent one. I want to pause here, because we are about a third of the way in, and this is the moment the pattern becomes visible. Every erasure so far has a name, a reign, and a reason attached to it. If that lands with you, do something small for me. Drop the word Named in the comments, and tell me what city you are watching from. I read them, and it tells me which parts of this are landing. Then stay with me because the chisel is about to leave Egypt and go south. And what it does down there is the part of this story I find hardest to sit with. Before we go south, there is a third kind of erasure to name, and it is the one you have almost certainly looked at without recognizing it. It belongs to a king who ruled for something like 66 years in the 13th century before Christ, long enough that most of his subjects were born and died under one man. Ramses II. The Great, they call him. He built more and signed more than almost anyone in the ancient world. The question worth asking is how much of what carries his name he actually made. Scholars have a plain word for what he did: usurpation. A later king takes a statue, a sphinx, a doorway, or a whole temple facade made by somebody earlier, cuts out the original owner's cartouche, and carves his own name into the empty space. The stone does not change. The face does not change. Only the signature changes. It is the ancient equivalent of buying a house and taking the previous family's name off the gate, except the house is 100 tons of granite, and the gate is meant to last forever. And Ramses did something clever to protect his own signature. Egyptian carvers could work in raised relief, cutting the background away so the figures stand up, or in sunk relief, cutting the design down into the surface. Sunk relief is harder to remove because to erase it, you have to take away the whole thickness of stone it sits in. His cartouches on reused monuments tend to be cut deep enough that any successor wanting to do to him what he had done to others would have to grind away half the block to manage it. He had watched how this game was played, and he played it better. I want to be fair to him, because it is easy to hear this as theft and stop there. In a country where quarrying, hauling, and dressing stone consumed a serious portion of national labor, reusing a monument was not vandalism. It was economics, and it was a legitimacy claim, a way of saying the line runs through me now. Nearly every long-reigning Egyptian king did some version of it. This is normal royal behavior in that world. But normal behavior still leaves the record altered, and centuries later somebody has to sit with a magnifier and work out whose face is actually on that statue. Now south, up the river, past the cataract, into what is now Sudan, because there is a chapter of Egyptian history that gets one sentence in most classrooms, and it deserves an hour of its own. In the 8th century before Christ, Egypt was fractured, its central authority in pieces, and the power that came to put it back together did not come from the Mediterranean. It came upriver from the kingdom of Kush, from the region around Napata beneath the sandstone hill at Gebel Barkal, deep in Africa. Their kings took Egypt, not as raiders passing through, but as pharaohs, crowned, titled, ruling both lands. Egyptologists number them the 25th dynasty. Pa, who came north and set out his account of the campaign on a great stela at Gebel Barkal, Shabaka, and Taharka, who ruled a stretch of the 7th century before Christ, over an empire running from the delta to deep in Sudan, and who built at Karnak, at Kawa, at Sanaan, restoring old temples and putting up new colonnades. And you can find that man in your Bible. 2 Kings, chapter 19, verse 9, names Tirhaka king of Cush, marching out while Jerusalem was under Assyrian threat, and Isaiah 37, verse 9 says the same. That is Taharka, a Cushite pharaoh from what is now Sudan. In the biblical text, moving armies in the same generation as Hezekiah and Isaiah. If you grew up in the black church, hearing that Africa sits at the edge of Scripture, that verse alone is worth reading again, slowly. Here is what strikes me most about the 25th dynasty. They did not arrive to overthrow Egyptian religion. They arrived to restore it. Their sculptors deliberately revived styles centuries out of date. Their kings honored Amun, the same god Akhenaten had gone after, and they rebuilt what earlier neglect had let fall down. They were the conservatives, and that is one of the reasons their period produced such extraordinary sculpture. Portraits with heavy realism in the face, unmistakably individual. Some of the finest work anyone in the ancient world ever cut out of stone. Their rule in the north did not last. The Assyrian Empire came down on Egypt in force in the 7th century, took the Delta, sacked Thebes, and the Kushite kings pulled back to their own country and went on ruling there for centuries afterward, at Napata, and later at Meroe. That is not a collapse. That is a retreat into a homeland that kept its own kings, its own writing, and its own pyramids, long after Egypt had passed to other hands. Then, around 593 before Christ, an Egyptian king of the Sate dynasty, named Psamtik II, sent an army south into Kush. And in 2003, a Swiss archaeological mission, led by Charles Bonnet, digging at Duki Gel just outside ancient Kerma in Sudan, opened a pit and found what somebody had put there. Statues of the Kushite pharaohs, Taharka among them, deliberately broken, faces and crowns struck, then gathered up and buried together in the ground. Sit with that image for a moment. Somebody knelt in that dirt and buried the broken kings. Most scholars connect the destruction to Psamtik's campaign, and I think that is the strongest reading available, but I want to be honest that it is a connection argued from context, not a signed confession. What is not in doubt is the deliberateness. These faces were not weathered, whether rounds a nose and softens an edge over centuries. It does not shear a crown cleanly off a head and leave the polished cheek beside it intact. This was tools and hands and a decision, and it carried the same logic we watched at Deir el-Bahri, aimed this time at black African kings who had worn the double crown of Egypt and ruled from it. And once again, the burial is why we have them. Fragments lifted, joined, and set up in the museum at Kerma, where you can stand in front of Taharka's face today. Whoever broke him did not manage to end him. He only put him in the ground, and the ground kept him. That is now 3 separate erasures in this episode that failed for exactly the same reason. And in a little while I am going to tell you what all of them have in common. But first, the argument you came for. You have heard the claim. Maybe from an uncle, maybe from a video, maybe from a teacher who meant well, that the noses on Egyptian statues are broken because somebody wanted the faces to stop looking African, that Napoleon's soldiers used the Sphinx for target practice and shot the nose off, and that the same hand went through the galleries taking the noses off the rest. I have heard it my whole life. I want to treat it seriously, because it did not come from nowhere, and the people repeating it are not fools. Understand why that claim has such a grip. It is built on top of something true. Egypt was pulled away from Africa in the books for a century and a half, and we will get to exactly how in a few minutes. When people have been misled about the big thing, they will believe almost anything about the small thing. And that is not stupidity. That is a reasonable response to a broken relationship with the record. So I am not going to wave the story off. I am going to test it the way we have tested everything else tonight, with dates. Start with the Sphinx, since it is the centerpiece of the story. Napoleon Bonaparte's expedition landed in Egypt in 1798. That is our fixed point, and it is not in dispute by anyone on any side of this. Whatever the French army did or did not do to that monument, it did it after that year, because before that year, it was not there. So the whole claim reduces to one question a child could ask. Did the Sphinx still have a nose in 1797? It did not. About 60 years before Napoleon, in 1737, a Danish naval officer named Frederick Louis Norden traveled up the Nile making careful drawings of what he saw, and those drawings were published for European readers. His Sphinx has no nose. It is sitting there in the picture, damaged decades before a single French soldier set foot on that sand. That alone ends the canon story. Not by argument, by calendar. And we can go back much further than a drawing. An Egyptian historian named al-Makrizi, writing in the 15th century, recorded that the damage was done in the 1370s by a man from a Sufi order, and that the local people, who were furious about it and depended on that monument, dealt with him harshly. Note who is angry in that story. Egyptians defending the face of the Sphinx, whether every detail of the account is exact. Historians debate, and I hold it loosely for that reason. But it puts the destruction of the face in the 14th century, 400 years before Napoleon, in a written source that had no stake whatsoever in the argument you and I are having tonight. So the popular version fails on its own timeline. I want to say that carefully, because I know how it feels to have a story you have carried for decades taken off the table. It is not a small thing, but a claim that collapses the moment somebody checks a date is not protection. It is exposure. Anyone who wants to discredit the whole subject of African history in one move will go straight for the weakest sentence you said. And this is that sentence. So let it go, and take what I am about to give you instead. Because it is better. Because the noses are broken. That part is completely true, and it is not an accident. Walk any large Egyptian collection, and you will notice once somebody points it out to you, how many faces are missing exactly the same piece. It is not random, and that pattern has been the subject of serious study. In 2019, the Brooklyn Museum mounted an exhibition on precisely this question, called Striking Power, put together by their curator of Egyptian art, Edward Bleiberg, and it laid the argument out for the public in a way I had never seen done before. Here is the case. The damage repeats in specific places. The nose, the arms, especially the one that would hold out an offering, the ears on some reliefs, the tip of a hand. If statues were simply falling over across 3,000 years, the damage would be random, and the nose, as the most projecting part of a face, would take a lot of it. But look at figures carved flat into a wall, sunk into the surface, with nothing projecting at all. Their noses are cut out too. A flat nose cannot break off in a fall. Somebody has to come with a tool and remove it. And once you know what these images were believed to be, the pattern reads instantly. Remember what we said about the name. The same logic applied to the body. A statue was not a portrait. It was a residence, a place a spirit could occupy so that it could receive offerings, breathe, eat, and act in the world. So how do you shut one down? You take the nose, so it cannot breathe. You take the arm, so it cannot receive. You do not need to smash the whole thing. You need to disable it, the way you would pull a wire out of a machine. So who did it? Mostly people in antiquity, and mostly for the reasons we have been tracing all night. A successor canceling a predecessor, a priesthood settling a theological argument, a later religion decommissioning images it considered dangerous, tomb robbers disabling the owner so he could not come after them, which is a real proposed motive, and one of the most human details in all of this. Egyptians, Cushites, Romans, and others across a very long stretch of time, all reaching for the same weak points because they shared the same belief about what a statue was. Now sit with the difference between the two stories. In the rumor, the erasure is a 19th century racial cover-up, and the evidence for it is a nose that was already gone before the alleged culprit arrived. In the documented version, the erasure is systematic, deliberate, thousands of examples deep, carried out for 3 millennia, and every element of it can be checked in a museum database from your phone tonight. Which of those is the stronger claim? Which one survives contact with a hostile question? That is the whole reason I do it this way. I would rather hand you a smaller number of things that cannot be taken away from you than a larger number that fall apart the first time somebody pushes. The erasure of Egypt's records is real. We have spent an hour proving it, with named kings and named centuries. It just does not need the canon. Everything we have looked at so far was done with metal. Now I want to show you the second erasure, and it did not use a chisel at all. It used a rune, a label, and a syllabus. And I believe it did more lasting damage to how you were taught to see Egypt than every hacked cartouche in this episode put together. Go into almost any large encyclopedic museum in Europe or America and watch how the building is organized. Egypt has its own wing, vast, well-lit. The mummies, the granite, the gold, the school groups. Now go and find the African collection. It is somewhere else entirely, often on a different floor, and it is arranged on a different principle. Masks and textiles and carved wood presented as culture and craft rather than as the record of states with kings and dates. 2 rooms, 1 continent. Nothing was destroyed to make that happen. Somebody just decided where things go, and that decision traveled into everything downstream of it. Nubia and Sudan, the very country we were standing in a few minutes ago with Taharqa, were studied for generations mainly as an appendix to Egyptology, a border zone, interesting for what it received from the north rather than for what it built and sent back. The Kushite pharaohs got a paragraph, if that. I sat in classrooms where the 25th dynasty was a footnote in a chapter about decline. Nobody lied to me. They simply put it in the small type. And there is a moment in living memory where you can watch the priority get said out loud when the Aswan High Dam went up through the 1960s. The rising water was going to drown a long stretch of Nubia. UNESCO launched an enormous international campaign to save the monuments. And it worked. Abu Simbel was cut into blocks and lifted to higher ground, an astonishing piece of engineering that I am glad happened. Meanwhile, tens of thousands of Nubian people were moved off that land to resettlement towns, and their villages went under the lake. The temples were rescued. The living community was relocated. Both of those are facts, and I have sat with the order of them for years. Here is the theory that sat underneath the filing. 19th and early 20th century scholarship carried an idea now called the Hamitic hypothesis, and in 1930 it reached a very wide readership through a short and enormously influential book by the British scholar Charles Gabriel Seligman, called The Races of Africa. Stripped of its academic clothing, the idea ran like this. Where you find real achievement on the African continent states, monumental building, cattle, metalwork, you should look for incomers from outside Africa, who brought it in. Follow that logic and you can see what it does. It never denies the pyramids. It just refuses to let Africa be their author. Every impressive thing gets reassigned to an arriving stream from somewhere north or east, and the continent is left as the place where things landed. That framework organized textbooks, museum labels, and university syllabi for decades. It was abandoned by scholarship in the second half of the 20th century, and abandoned thoroughly. But a room built on an old idea does not rearrange itself when the idea is dropped, and the labels take even longer. I want to be exact about the target here, because this is the part people get wrong when they repeat me. The problem is a theory, published, named, dated, and now discarded. It is not a nation. It is not a people. Europeans did not gather in a hall and vote to hide Africa from you. And if anybody tells you they did, ask them for the minutes. What happened is duller and more effective. A framework was taught, teachers taught it, curators arranged rooms around it, and 100 years went by. Attack, a classification. Never the population. Then people pushed back, in the open, in the institutions. In 1974, UNESCO convened a symposium in Cairo on the peopling of ancient Egypt, and it was not a quiet meeting. 2 African scholars, Cheikh Anta Diop of Senegal and Théophile Obenga of Congo, came with detailed arguments that ancient Egypt belonged culturally and linguistically to Black Africa. And they put those arguments in front of a room of specialists who largely disagreed with them. The record of that meeting shows their case was argued at length and was not accepted by everyone present, and that the symposium closed calling for more research. Nobody got silenced. Nobody won a clean victory. I have gone back and forth on how to say the next part for a long time, and I am going to say it straight, because you have given me an hour of your evening, and you deserve better than a slogan. Here is what I will tell you plainly. Egypt is in Africa. It always was. It sits on an African river with continuous traffic north and south, and the same river carried people, gods, grain, and armies in both directions for thousands of years. Kings from Sudan wore the double crown. That is not a theory. That is a dynasty with a number. And here is what I will not do. I will not hand you one word as the racial answer for a population of millions across 3,000 years. Because the honest position is that our racial categories were invented long after the last pharaoh, mostly in the last few centuries, and they do not map cleanly onto how the Egyptians described themselves. They divided the world in ways that would not fit our forms. Scholars still differ on this, seriously and in print, and anybody selling you a settled one-word answer is selling you something, whichever direction they are selling it in. What I can give you is the pattern, and the pattern is enough. Egyptian history was cut into by Egyptian kings for succession and for theology. It was cut into again by later powers moving up and down the river, and then it was quietly sorted into the wrong drawer by a scholarly theory that has a title, an author, and a publication year. 3 erasures, all documented, none of them requiring a secret. Which brings us to the only question left worth asking. What actually sets one of these off? So let me put the answer on the table, plainly, the way I have come to understand it after years of circling this. There are 4 triggers, and every erasure we have looked at tonight runs on one or more of them. Not one of the 4 requires a conspiracy. All 4 of them are boring. That is exactly why they work. Trigger 1 is succession. A new ruler needs the story of legitimate power to run cleanly through him, and anybody sitting in the record in an awkward position is a problem to be managed. That is Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh standing in the middle of a line that had to be argued forward to a son. It is not hatred. It is the tidying up of a family tree by a man who has the labor to do it in stone. Trigger 2 is theology. Where an image is believed to be alive, mutilating it is not symbolic. It is effective action. Cut the nose, and the thing cannot breathe. Cut the name, and the offerings stop. That is, Akhenaten's gangs going after Amun across the country. And it is the same reasoning behind thousands of broken faces in museum cases tonight. When people genuinely believe a statue can act, damaging it is the rational move. Trigger 3 is economics. Stone is heavy, quarrying is expensive, and the predecessor's temple is a free quarry with the blocks already cut and dressed. That is Ramesses, re-signing what he did not build. That is, Akhenaten's small blocks packed inside a gateway at Karnak. Nobody set out to hide anything. They needed fill, and there was a building standing right there. A great deal of the ancient record was altered by men trying to save money, and trigger 4 is the quiet one. Classification. Long after everyone involved is dead, somebody writes a label, chooses a room, sets a syllabus, publishes a book, and the object stays exactly where it is, while the meaning around it is rearranged. No tools, no malice required. Just a framework, taught to students who become teachers. That is the Hamitic hypothesis, and the wing on the 2nd floor, and I believe it is the one that reached you personally.
Now I want to stop the history for a minute and tell you something about myself, because it would be dishonest to hand you all of this without it. When I first started reading into this material, I wanted the conspiracy version, I really did. Not because I'm gullible, but because it explained the feeling. If you grew up sensing that the story you were handed had been cut, the plot version puts a face on that feeling and gives you somewhere to aim it. And I built some of my early understanding on exactly that, including the canon history about the spring. I repeated it to the people I respect. Then somebody who knew the material sat me down and asked me one question. What year did Napoleon arrive? And what year was the drawing made? And the whole thing went out from under me in about 10 seconds. What I felt was not embarrassment. Or not only that, I was exposure. Because everything true I had said that day went out with it. That is the part nobody warns you about.
When you attach real history to a weak claim, the weak claim does not get stronger. The real history gets dragged down with it, and the person across the table gets to walk away thinking the whole subject is nonsense. So here is where I have landed, and I hold it with an open hand. The plot version is easier to tell. It moves faster, and it collapses the moment anyone checks a date. The paperwork version is slower. It is less satisfying to shout, and it cannot be taken away from you. Give me a shelf of dull, checkable facts over a thrilling story with a soft floor, every single time, and I have come to believe something harder than that too. A boring decision, repeated for a century, does more damage than a secret meeting ever could. A secret has to be kept, and secrets leak. A filing choice does not need to be kept. It just needs to be inherited by people who never questioned it, because it was simply how the building was arranged when they arrived. And now let me give you the part of this that I think is genuinely beautiful, because we have spent an hour on destruction, and the ending is not what you would expect. Every single erasure in this episode failed. Not one of them worked, and they all failed for the same unglamorous reason, which is that destroying stone properly is more expensive than hiding it. And men working for wages take the cheaper option. Hatshepsut. Her figures were cut out. Her blocks were broken up and thrown into foundations and fill. Buried stone does not weather, does not fade, does not lose its paint. Archaeologists lifted those blocks out of the ground in their thousands and rebuilt her chapels from the rubble that was meant to finish her. Her statues went into pits near her own temple, and in the 1920s, they came back out of those pits and were joined together again. She is standing in museums right now because somebody buried her carefully instead of burning her. Akhenaten. His city was pulled apart and his small blocks were carried to Karnak and packed inside the great gateways, as fill, faces turned inward, sealed in the dark. 3,000 years later, the pylons were opened, and the blocks came out with the paint still bright on them, better preserved than anything left in the sun. The men dismantling that king built him a vault, and did not know it. His lost temple scenes are being reassembled from those blocks. To this day, the Kushite kings. Somebody broke their faces at Dukhi-Gel, and then gathered up the pieces and put them in a pit in the ground of Sudan, and the ground held them until 2003, when Charles Bonnet's team lifted them out. Taharka's face is in the museum at Kerma. The pharaoh named in 2 Kings, chapter 19, verse 9, whose likeness somebody took a tool to, is looking back at visitors today in his own country. Do you see the pattern? Erasure is loud, expensive, and lazy. Preservation happens by accident, in the dirt, inside walls, under floors.
I have come to think of it almost as a law. The thing they bury is the thing that survive. And the monuments left standing proudly in the sun are the ones that wore down to nothing. There's a kind of justice in that which I did not put there and cannot explain away.
So what do you do with an hour like this? I do not want you to just feel something and go to bed, because feelings fade by Thursday and facts do not. I want to hand you something you can hold. And the good news is that almost all of it is free and sitting in your pocket right now. The major museums have put their collection databases online. Open one on your phone tonight and search Karma, search Kawa, search Deir el-Bahri, search Talatat. You will get objects, and each object has fields underneath the picture, and the field that matters is provenance, which tells you where the thing was found, when, and by whom. Read that line, not the headline. The provenance line is where the history actually lives, and read who excavated and in what year, and then look up that excavation. That is how you go from believing something to knowing it. It takes an evening. It costs nothing. Nobody has to give you permission. No gatekeeper has to approve you. And no institution can quietly take it back from you afterward. Because once you have checked the date yourself, it is yours. That is what I mean when I say the documented version is heavier, not colder. Heavier, It has weight you can lean on in an argument with somebody who is not on your side. And I would rather send you into that argument with 3 things you have verified than 30 you have inherited. So let me tell you what you are walking away with tonight, because it is not a feeling, and it is not a slogan. You are walking away with names. Hatshepsut cut off her own walls decades after her death by a king managing a succession. Akhenaten, who sent men out with tools and then had the same thing done to him. Ramesses, signing what he did not build. Taharka, a Kushite pharaoh out of Sudan, who wore the double crown, and whose broken face somebody buried in the ground at Duki Gel. Those are not opinions. They are people, with reigns, in the record. And I want to be careful about how we hold that, because heritage gets ruined when it is handled badly. What I have given you tonight is documentary and cultural, not biological. I have made no claim about anyone's blood, and I will not, because that road always ends somewhere ugly, and because it is not necessary. The connection between Africa and this history does not run through a laboratory. It runs through a river, a border that people crossed in both directions for 3,000 years, and a dynasty of African kings who ruled Egypt and left their names carved in it. If you grew up in the Black Church, you have heard some of these places sung about your whole life without knowing the archaeology sitting under them. Psalm 68 verse 31 speaks of Ethiopia stretching out her hands to God. Isaiah 18 opens by addressing the land beyond the rivers of Cush. Those verses were written by people who knew that a great power lived upriver, because it did, and because its kings show up by name a few chapters over. I read those lines differently now than I did 20 years ago, and I suspect some of you will too. Here is the image I want to leave in your mind. A block of painted stone, carrying a name somebody was paid to destroy, sitting in the dark, inside the belly of a gateway at Karnak. 3,000 years of sun and wind and empire pass over that wall. Dynasties end, languages die, and that name sits there in the dark, in perfect condition, waiting. It outlasted the man who ordered it removed, and it outlasted every version of the story that left it out. Now let me say the honest thing before we close. Scholars have weighed this material for well over a century, and they still disagree about a great deal of it, including the exact year that erasure at Deir el-Bahri began, including how far a campaign into Kush explains a pit of broken statues, including the whole question of how the people of the Nile describe themselves. What I have offered you tonight is one careful reading, and every date in it can be checked. Go and check them. Study the primary sources for yourself, and hold me to them. If this hour was worth your time, subscribe, because we are going to keep doing exactly this, one recovered piece at a time. And if there is someone in your life who has been carrying the shot-off nose story for 30 years, send this to them gently, not to embarrass anybody, to hand them something sturdier to stand on. Let us pray. Father, we thank you for truth that does not need to be protected from questions. We thank you for every hand that carved a name and every hand that dug one back out of the ground. We ask your blessing over all people tonight, every nation, every family, every tongue, because we all came out of the same beginning, and we all stand in the same light. Guard the ones who are still searching for a history that was filed away from them. Give them patience for the slow work, and courage for the honest answer. And to everyone watching, may you carry your ancestors well, with evidence in your hands and no bitterness in your chest. Amen. Walk remembered. Walk forward.